now you've probably heard at least about the concept of the coup in Niger. For those of you that haven't, I'll give you a quick primer. Essentially, in late July 2023, in the West African country of Niger, the president was forced out of office by an armed group led by the former commander of the Presidential Guard, Abdourahmane Chiani. In a press release, Chiani, flanked by 9 other military officers, clarified the reasoning for such an action and the situation at hand. Chiani stated that the forces, who were now dubbed the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, CNSP for short, had decided to do so due to, quote, the deteriorating security situation and bad governance. The CNSP also announced the dissolution of the country's constitution, the suspension of state institutions, and a curfew for the populace. Later, it was also declared that the activities of political parties were also suspended until further notice. We're now generally caught up with the information available at the time of writing coming out of Niger, but we have yet to even touch on the significance of this event. Now, a coup in Niger is unfortunately not particularly out of the ordinary, as the country has been forced into 5 periods of violent instability since independence from the French Empire in 1960. What's different about this coup is the reasoning and the way it impacts the rest of the world. During the coup d'etat, Russian flags were being waved by demonstrators, leading to the speculation that the Russian state had been involved in some way, while the Russian mercenary group, with troubling far-right connections, the Wagner Group, claims involvement. It is unclear to what extent Russia has been involved in these developments. In my opinion, what's more likely than an organization thoroughly infiltrated by neo-Nazi and white supremacist elements aiding an African anti-colonial movement is that the Russian flag was being used to encourage sympathy on the part of the emerging Russo-Chinese anti-American geopolitical pole in a move to avoid European and American forces immediately violently suppressing the new government, as they did in neighboring Mali in 2013. Speaking of Mali, the state there and also the state of Burkina Faso, both nearby West African countries, have both pledged to defend Niger from Western meddling, a development that has certainly given pause to open French and American calls for intervention. At this point, if you're not particularly up on your West African geopolitics, you might be forgiven for asking, why is everyone so invested in this Niger situation? What makes Niger so special? Well, straw man, let me tell you. We'll start with the Yankee Pig Dogs. The US owns and operates one of the largest and most important drone bases in the world out of Niger, a slice of neo-colonial hell called Airbase 201 in Agadez, Niger. Just a side note, this base took $110 million to build, and also requires an additional $20 to $30 million per year to maintain. Fantastic use of American tax dollars, if you ask me. Niger is very important to the US's, quote, Africa strategy, something that all countries 4,000 miles away from Africa should of course have. Essentially, Airbase 201 is one of the seats of the unmanned air forces that the US uses to conduct counter-terrorism, read, enforce American empire in Africa. Lest you think US hold on Niger is tenuous, there are several other drone bases, one in the capital Niamey, and another allegedly in use by the CIA in northeastern Niger. While the base in Agadez was being constructed, American state-affiliated media, PBS, described it as the, quote, largest installation Air Force personnel have ever built. Not only that, but Niger is also home to substantial reserves of the US's absolute favorite planet-destroying addiction, oil. But of course the parasites in DC aren't the only game in town. There are also parasites in Paris that are getting in on this imperial international commodity production. France relies heavily on nuclear energy, as any anti-nuclear German can tell you. So much that it consumes nuclear power at similar rates to oil-generated power. But, you know, to run a nuclear reactor, you need some nuclear stuff. In this case, uranium. And you know where best to get uranium if you're a colonial power that maintains a neo-colonial relationship with West Africa? That's right! You can just steal it from Niger. In the past 10 years, France has imported 17,615 tons of uranium from Niger, making the West African country their second biggest supplier of uranium after Kazakhstan. Meanwhile, here's a fun fact. Well, not so much a fun fact, but a fact nonetheless. Nearly 90% of Nigerians have no access to electricity. Interesting. I wonder why that could be. Perhaps decades of enforced political instability designed to keep commodity prices low and domestic production low to encourage imports from a colonial master. France, by the way, is a part of the European Union. This will make sense in a moment. The European Union and its military arm NATO are currently embroiled in another small conflict you might have heard something about in the Ukraine. As a particularly pointlessly destructive part of this conflict, NATO and its member countries have inflicted sanctions on Russia, who is supporting the other side. This is important insofar as it has forced European countries to go cold turkey with Russian oil, who was, until the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, the largest supplier of oil in Europe. Because, of course, limiting consumption of this literally planet-destroying commodity is too pie in the sky for the neoliberal order. Europe has been forced to replace this consumption with instead oil imported from
North America, namely the US.
You might have noticed that North America is a few thousand miles away, so Europeans have had to pay massively inflated oil, natural gas, and electricity costs as a result of Russian sanctions. So will France tolerate national sovereignty over huge uranium and oil reserves just because they belong to the Nigerians? Of course not. That would be, how do you say, ridicule, however the fuck you say that in French. The colonial subjects must be brought into line to supply needed resources to the colonial master. The US, of course, recognizes this too, which is why they were so close with the previous Nigerian administration. In fact, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken took a trip to the country in March, a move that was historically unprecedented. Around the same time, Brown University researcher Stephanie Savelle said, Niger is one of the last strongholds of US security partnerships in the region. Late in 2022, in fact, the White House brought many African heads of state to DC to meet with Sleepy Brandon, during which the State Department wrote that the summit was, quote, rooted in this recognition that Africa is a key geopolitical player. In short, Niger has until now served as a key exporter of several precious resources, such as uranium, oil, and gold. I didn't even mention the gold, but yeah, Niger has vast gold reserves that have also been plundered by French and American colonial exploiters. But I'm getting sidetracked. France used a plentiful supply of artificially cheap uranium to underlie nearly a third of their electrical grid in the form of nuclear energy, while the US also used the country as a playground for its military, allowing not only several branches of the US military, but also, allegedly, the CIA to operate from within, projecting imperial power across Africa. Before the war in Ukraine and the rising anti-colonial sentiment in Africa, Niger was seen as a place where both of these, quote, needs could be met. That is, until the CNSP ousted the previous administration and blocked uranium and gold exports. The organization has vocally characterized their movement as anti-imperial, and has joined with neighboring Burkina Faso and Malian administrations, who are explicitly inspired by Thomas Sankara, a Pan-Africanist, Marxist African leader from the 1980s. In a statement, the countries declared that, quote, any military intervention in Niger would be considered a declaration of war against their two countries. This emerging anti-colonial bloc in West Africa, while being far from ideologically or politically stable, is at least ostensibly fighting against American and French empire. The same cannot be said for ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, who are closely allied with the West. Neighboring Nigeria, which has previously supplied about 70% of the electricity that Niger did have, recently cut off access to that power, while also moving to establish a de facto blockade. ECOWAS's member states have also drawn up plans for intervention, giving diplomatic cover to European and American calls for a reinstatement of the previous administration. Now, I can't say what the future entails, particularly in a context I'm unfamiliar with and highly removed from, but what I can say is that the developments in Niger are a result of Western imperialism, and the emerging anti-imperial bloc in West Africa is an equal and opposite reaction to decades of artificial instability and scarcity inflicted by the parasites in DC and Paris. Parasites in DC and Paris. All I can do is hope for a peaceful solution and sovereignty for the Nigerian people. Since the writing of this script in August 2023, a lot has happened in Niger. Tensions intensified in the fall, with the transitional government issuing a temporary ban on UN activities that has since been lifted. Tensions with ECOWAS flared up over the timeline of new elections, which resulted in sanctions and economic turmoil, from the repeal of exploitative tax policies designed to profit Paris. The US removing the country from a regional trade deal, Niger's withdrawal from the regional G5 military agreement, and the EU instituting new sanctions on the country. This has led to a 40% drop in government revenue and a 70% drop in the electrical supply, which have understandably caused many issues for everyday Nigerians. This confrontational approach has led the transitional government to lean more heavily on regional partners, founding the Alliance of Sahel States in September. The agreement consists of a mutual defense pact with Mali and Burkina Faso against military intervention by ECOWAS and Western forces. This alliance has filled the gap of the G5 in Niger, coordinating action among member states to crack down on Islamist insurgents in the area. Later in the year, ECOWAS ended up suspending Niger from the bloc. Throughout this time, Anti-French mass demonstrations took place near constantly outside of French military bases and governmental institutions, eventually leading to the complete expulsion of the French military and the closure of the French embassy by December 22nd. Going into the winter, however, things began to smooth over. A new solar plant was opened to help mitigate electrical issues caused by sanctions. Neighboring Benin denounced said sanctions and moved to establish relations with the new government. Diplomatic talks have also taken place between Niger and a host of other nations, most notably the Sahelian neighbors of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, but also reportedly Turkey, Iran, and Serbia. Throughout this process, relations with the US have improved, likely due to the country's comparatively good historical relations, the wise use of the US military's presence in the country as a bargaining chip, and the use of Russian relations as a counterbalance to American interests. Moscow has had a presence in the region for quite a while, and relations have been established with the new government, with the Prime Minister actually visiting Russia in mid-January. It seems, at least to me, that Niger is wisely looking to play both the American and Russian geopolitical blocs off of one another, as it hasn't outright condemned nor joined either, but has also utilized what leverage it has to benefit Niger. Of course, my perspective is incredibly limited, and these are all brand new developments, but to my eyes, it seems that Niger is utilizing some similar tactics to those of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, which proved to be, at least temporarily, highly effective, allowing the people of Egypt, Yugoslavia, India, and others to navigate the shifting landscape of the Cold War to their benefit. We can only hope that this strategy once more proves effective, and more importantly, provides lasting stability for the people of West Africa. Thanks for watching. Further reading is linked in the description, and all the other things I ended up cutting for time. If you liked this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. If you didn't, please leave me a comment berating me for having the gall to disagree with your programming. Bye.